Hello, my name is Professor Heschel, and this is the final and concluding lecture of the series that I've prepared on Jews and pandemics. I want to draw some conclusions from the material that I presented to you in the series of lectures that I already posted on Canvas. Just to review, we talked about the associations of Jews and plague that go all the way back to antiquity. We remember that in the Bible, plagues are frequently mentioned as a punishment from God. But more specifically, the association comes in the Hellenistic literature that describes what happened in Egypt. That is, centuries earlier, Egypt had suffered from a terrible epidemic, a terrible plague. And the Hellenistic writers suggest that the way Egypt cured itself of the plague was by expelling foreigners in its midst, that these foreigners had spread plague and promoted also a new religion that rejected the principles of Egyptian religion. The liberation, that is, the liberation and exodus from Egypt of the Hebrew slaves described in the Hebrew Bible, then became, in Hellenistic view, the expulsion of unwanted foreigners, called frequently lepers, and the association of Jews with disease, Jews with epidemic, Jews with leprosy, was embedded through this tradition in the Western imagination. It was called up from time to time when it seemed that it could be useful in a political situation, such as in 1321, when the massive attack on lepers in southern France quickly led to attacks against Jews and weapons, and also rumors that Jews were poisoning wells, and so were lepers. The underlying motivation at that point was a rebellion against the crown, and an attack on lepers and Jews fit that political goal since they were under the protection of the crown, as well as expressing an underlying association of leprosy with foreigners, with Jews. Yet, as the historian David Nurnberg has argued, the attacks were not simply one more expression of an inevitable, raging anti-Semitism of the West, but has to be seen in the particular political, historical context of that moment. And in fact, during subsequent instances of epidemic, Jews were usually not attacked. We have, in fact, examples of Jews living in both Christian and Muslim regions of the world, for instance, in Seville, Cyprus, Salonika, Egypt, that when plague struck, Jews were included in the prayers and religious processions that pleaded with God to lift the plague. So the Black Death violence of the 14th century was also followed almost immediately by a cessation of violence. In some regions, there was an almost immediate promotion of Jews to positions of authority and respect in the government. We see that in Spain. In other regions, something different happened. Instead of being beaten up, Jews were now expelled, something undertaken by legal means rather than by mob violence. And between 1350 and 1500, there was relatively little mob violence, some, but not a lot. And most, though not all, subsequent epidemics were not followed by mob violence against Jews. And even during the Black Death, we see occasional manifestations of solidarity with Jews, as in Cyprus. Moreover, as we know, each disease has its own metaphorical associations. Jews were not attacked for syphilis or for tuberculosis, which were very different kinds of illnesses with a prolonged death and carried very different aesthetic valences. But what about Jewish responses to epidemics and plagues? Those have been pretty straightforward. In the Talmud, the work of Jewish law, the teaching is very direct. If there is a plague, stay home. Don't go outside. Don't try to flee. Just quarantine yourselves at home. The angel of death, the Talmud says, is in the streets and does not distinguish between those who are pious and those who are wicked. All are vulnerable. Don't even go to a house of worship because the angel of death can be there as well. The plague, in other words, is not so much an act of God to punish an individual. It doesn't arouse worries of theodicy. Still, in rabbinic Judaism, watch your behavior. Of course, don't sin. Pray to God for mercy and pray to God to lift the plague. Rabbis already in the early modern period understood something of social distancing, what we're hearing about today during the coronavirus. They insisted, for example, that synagogue attendance should be kept limited, at most 15 people in the synagogue at one time, and they should spread out in that space, not sit near one another. A guard should be at the door and keep people out. They advised washing one's home, cleaning all the objects in the home, bathing frequently. These were measures that rabbis mandated alongside prayer, recitation of psalms, giving charity, caring for the sick. Some of the most distinguished rabbis told Jews not to even fast on Yom Kippur, the holy day of atonement, and to stay at home and not spend the whole day in the synagogue on the high holidays. It was too dangerous. But perhaps in these Jewish responses to epidemics, the most interesting, unique, and maybe even puzzling is what's called the Schwarze Chasana in Yiddish, the cemetery wedding, the black wedding with the canopy set up in a cemetery, the wedding canopy that's black instead of the traditional white. These Schwarze Chasanas, it seemed to have started in the late 18th century and have continued a little bit even to this day, were intended to ward off primarily the cholera epidemics that were recurring in Eastern Europe, and also influenza. But why hold a wedding at a time of a terrible epidemic? There are various associations between death and weddings within Jewish literature and religious practice, going back to the Talmud. We're told, for example, that every time a Jew gets married, the souls of the ancestors of the bride and groom come and gather under the wedding canopy and celebrate with the bride and groom. In many ways, the weddings parallel other rituals, the Schwarze Chasana, that spring up in times of terror. That can be a rain dance at a time of a drought, for instance. It can shore up community solidarity. The Schwarze Chasana also brings the community together, each person giving gifts to the couple, the bride and groom. An unfortunate couple sometimes. This was a bride and groom chosen by the local townspeople or village because they were in fact unfortunate, impoverished, orphans, people with all kinds of different disabilities, for instance, people who were viewed as ugly, deformed, deranged, who couldn't find a spouse or partner. So the couple might be chosen and married off to one another. They didn't choose each other, by the way. Might be chosen as a scapegoat for the community's sicknesses, or perhaps as a ceremony of penitence and charity, because everyone in the village would contribute gifts and set up a household for this bride and groom. Could also be seen as a way of frightening off the demons of disease, or perhaps persuading these demons that they already had a place in this village and that they could go somewhere else, kind of like putting a red thread on the crib of a newborn baby. Even I did that. Perhaps the wedding was also a distraction from the horror and misery of watching your loved ones get very, very sick and die quickly. And perhaps a plea to God to turn away from sickness and death and funerals and think more about weddings and celebrations, life and joy instead of death and sorrow. In a 1925 article analyzing a custom of breaking a glass at the very end of the wedding ceremony, Jewish wedding ceremony, Jacob Lauterbach describes 3 ways the custom sought to overcome demons who might potentially attack the bride and groom. 3 ways: fighting, bribing, or deceiving the demons. Such ritualized efforts at combating demons, breaking a glass, or tying a red thread on a crib, or making a Schwarze Chasana, it's not uncommon, and evidence can be found in the ancient Near East and even in the Bible, as our colleague, Professor Susan Ackerman, has written in a recent paper. Jacob Lauterbach concludes his article that by breaking the glass at the end of the wedding ceremony, we deceive the demons by making them think that the people at the wedding are not gay and happy, but rather worried about their impending death, and giving through this breaking of the glass an offering to the envious evil powers. To come back to the Schwarze Hasana, which is described in many Yiddish short stories, Jeffrey Chandler, a professor at Rutgers University, discusses a story by Jacob Opatoshu, A Wedding in a Cemetery. And he says that it reminds him of East European Jewish customs of placing a lock on a grave in order to keep the cause of the death from escaping the grave. Another custom was measuring tombstones with strings used to make candle wick. And those candle wicks were then lit on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, to ask the dead for protection. Holding a wedding in a cemetery also makes the dead witnesses of a good deed. And hopefully, Chandler writes, they might intervene in heaven on behalf of the community. The gifts presented to the bride and groom by the villagers are acts of transfer. Opatoshu describes this in his short story. Someone coming with a spoon or a pot and saying to the bride and groom, "From me to you," transferring their household to someone else, as if perhaps protecting their home from disease. Give it to you. And this, Chandler says, evokes a Jewish custom on the eve of the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, of shlugging kaporos, that is, of taking either a chicken or a handful of coins and transferring, through a formula, transferring one sin to the chicken or the coins that are then given to charity. Through this act of charity, may my sins be forgiven. And the poor might eat the chicken or use the money to buy a meal before the fast of Yom Kippur begins. Illnesses carry metaphorical implications. So Jews are associated with plague and leprosy, less so with syphilis, cholera, tuberculosis, or polio. But perhaps the issue is rather how a minority can become a pawn in political struggles, especially at a time of crisis. In some pockets of the United States today, protesters against these quarantines and lockdowns, protesters are using anti-Semitic images, and some include Nazi symbols and rhetoric, at times conflating Jews with Nazis or Jews as carriers of the disease. Interestingly, the outbreaks of anti-Semitism in recent years in the United States have been associated with protests against establishment authorities, most recently against the government officials and the lockdown. And this reminds us of what we saw in southern France in 1321. To attack Jews and lepers in 1321 was to rebel against royal authority. What's important to note is while Jews have certainly not been physically attacked every time there's an epidemic, the association of Jews with plague that started in antiquity could smolder in the Western imagination and be a repository that could be invoked whenever the political moment needed a justification to arouse a mob and express anger and resentment against government authorities. In preparing my lectures for this course, starting with the Hellenistic associations of the Israelites in Egypt, with foreigners spreading plague and then being expelled, I went through medieval episodes of plague in which Jews were included with Christians and with Muslims in religious processions at different times, plus advice from rabbis like the great Akiba Eger on social distancing. But there are other questions that remain for historians to investigate in the future. I wonder, for example, were Jews going to the mikveh, the ritual bath, during times of epidemic? And when an epidemic lasted a long time, that would cause a very serious problem for any Jew. So there are questions that remain that I hope will be investigated in the future. But I have to say, of all of these questions and the remarkable way in which rabbis in antiquity were suggesting the same kinds of quarantine and social distancing as we're hearing today from doctors and scientists and government officials, But among all of these, it's the Schwarze Chasana that I find most intriguing. It strikes me as the most interesting, the most creative and imaginative response to an epidemic that Jews ever came up with, or maybe anybody. I love it. I love the way the Schwarze Chasana accomplishes so many different things at once. Yes, it keeps the community together. It certainly distracts from the horror of the disease. It's an act of charity and so forth. And it also appeals, I think, by being so very bizarre to unconscious fantasies, becomes a way to enact and address them. These days, I hear from so many, and I read in the newspaper that people are having weird dreams and terrible nightmares during this particular corona pandemic. Around the world this year, in 2020, during the coronavirus pandemic, fears and fantasies have certainly been revived. To some extent, we're calmed by wise doctors, scientists, some political leaders, and yet our fears persist. All the horrors that we're feeling today, the sense of apocalypse and terror, not knowing when this will end, who will be affected, what's going on, whether we will ever have a vaccination or immunity of any kind. We have a revival of old fears, with people reporting dreams, for example, about Anne Frank, as if they're Anne Frank. This kind of horrific experience, these fears that come through in our dreams and sometimes come through our articulation of them, but these fantasies and fears, often unconscious, could be addressed very nicely by a Schwarze Chasana or some kind of equivalent. I think it's tremendously wise, the Schwarze Chasana, in enacting and giving voice to the repository of unconscious fears and fantasies that are very much also part of the plague and pandemic that's affecting us in 2020, and that I also hope will end soon. So my best wishes to all of you.